The air in the Miller penthouse 300 feet above the ceaseless hum of Chicago was always perfectly conditioned, scented with faint cedar and a sterile sense of achievement. Ethan Miller, a man whose tailored suits reflected his status as a successful architect, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the glittering grid of the city. He and his wife, Clara, were a masterpiece of modern American aspiration. Beautiful, accomplished, and utterly disconnected. They were the city's perfect power couple, a narrative they curated with meticulous detail, yet their home was less a sanctuary and more a polished, very expensive museum for two polite strangers. Clara, a sharp-featured, ambitious director of marketing, was already dressed in a charcoal silk sheath, preparing for a high-stakes meeting. "Did you remember to send the confirmation for the Riviera project dinner?" she asked, her voice efficient, not requiring an emotional response, merely a confirmation of task completion. "Done last night," Ethan replied, turning from the window. He was a master of the smooth reply, the flawless execution of routine. It was this surface perfection he used to hide the deep, festering wound within. 5 years ago, during a brutal, soul-crushing business trip to New York, he had made a singular, catastrophic mistake, a single alcohol-fueled night of reckless abandon with a stranger in a midtown hotel. It was a lapse he had filed away in a lead-lined box in his mind, vowing never to open it, never to let the toxic fumes touch his curated reality. The wound, however, had just walked into his life, not as a memory, but as a colleague of his wife, Daniel Sterling. He joined Clara's firm 6 weeks ago, a transfer from the West Coast office, immediately seizing a powerful co-lead role on Clara's most critical campaign. Ethan had first met him at an impromptu cocktail party the firm hosted. Daniel was handsome in a predatory, lean way, with eyes that seemed to absorb more light than they reflected. When Daniel had been introduced to Ethan, he hadn't offered a firm handshake or a friendly greeting. Instead, he had simply held Ethan's gaze for a beat too long, and a thin, knowing smirk had played across his lips, a smirk that Ethan instantly recognized. It was the same look of detached amusement he'd seen that morning after in New York, right before the stranger had vanished from his life. The recognition was a physical punch. Ethan had spent the last 6 weeks walking a tightrope of existential dread, observing Daniel from a safe distance, searching for confirmation while simultaneously praying for a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe all ambitious men in their late 30s had that exact cynical smile. But Daniel's presence was a continuous, subtle torture. He'd occasionally linger during their brief elevator rides, mentioning a casual detail that felt deeply personal, like asking if the architecture firm still suffered from that nasty, leaky faucet in the main office bathroom. A complaint Ethan had only mentioned to his one-night stand in a vulnerable moment of post-coital conversation. This morning, the confirmation arrived not through a knowing glance, but through the cold, inescapable logic of technology. Clara was in the kitchen, scrolling through her work emails. "Ugh, Daniel keeps mixing up the Miller addresses," she sighed, frowning at her phone. "He sent the final deck for the pitch to my personal email instead of the work account. So annoying." She turned to Ethan, her brow furrowed with mild irritation. "Can you check if he sent it to yours too? He tends to autofill." Ethan's heart seized. He opened his personal email app, his fingers suddenly clumsy on the slick glass screen. The inbox blinked. There it was, a new email from Daniel Sterling. Subject, final pitch deck, urgent. He clicked it open. The attachment was there, but it was the main body of the email that made the blood drain from his face. It was just one sentence, seemingly benign, a casual postscript clearly intended for Clara's eyes only. "P.S. Make sure you get some decent sleep tonight. You looked a little rough after that late-night whiskey the other day. Remember what I said about those little porcelain cups?" The words porcelain cups were the key. That night in New York, after their drunken, desperate coupling, Ethan had confessed to the stranger, Daniel, that he hated the cheap white porcelain cups in the hotel rooms. It was a meaningless detail, a throwaway line. Yet it was specific, private, and now it was a weapon. Ethan closed the app, his hands shaking imperceptibly. He took a slow breath, forcing the corners of his mouth to lift into a relaxed, effortless smile. "No, nothing here, Clara. Looks like you're the lucky recipient," he said, his voice level, practiced. "Good," she replied, slipping her phone into her handbag, already moving toward the door. "We have the company annual dinner this Friday. It's huge. Everyone will be there. You're coming, right? I need you there. It's important for the optics." Optics. That was all their life was, a careful calibration of optics. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Ethan murmured, walking her to the door. He kissed her cheek, a chaste, dutiful peck. As the elevator doors hissed shut, taking Clara away to her world of corporate battles, Ethan stood alone in the perfect, silent apartment. The golden cage had just gotten smaller. The terror was no longer a ghost. It was real, it was present, and it was waiting for him at the most public, most consequential event of the year. The company dinner. The simple knowledge. Daniel knew everything, and he was choosing to play a long, cold game, was more terrifying than any direct confrontation. Ethan was trapped, the past reaching out to destroy his future, and the only path forward was through a minefield laid by the one man he had betrayed his wife with. The silence of the penthouse had become a suffocating shroud. Ethan found himself retreating to his glass-walled office, ostensibly to work on blueprints, but in reality, to sift through the ash and ruin of the past. The porcelain cup's email was no longer a hint. It was a signed confession from the universe. Daniel Sterling was the ghost that had returned to haunt him, wearing an expensive suit and occupying the desk next to his wife. The memory of New York, previously a blurry, shame-drenched vignette, now sharpened into agonizing clarity. It had been the culmination of 6 months of building their perfect life in Chicago, a life that felt more like a construction project than a marriage. Clara was soaring in her career. Ethan was landing marquee architectural projects. But the deeper they dug the foundations of their professional success, the less time they spent on the foundation of their relationship. That night, Ethan had been alone in a soulless hotel room, staring at the fluorescent city lights, feeling the chilling vacuum of true solitude. He remembered the bar near the financial district, the whiskey burning away the edges of his professionalism, the desperate need for human connection, any connection, that had nothing to do with blueprints or quarterly reports. And then, Daniel. He had been quieter then, softer around the edges, but with the same unnerving intensity in his eyes. They had talked for hours, sharing a brief incandescent honesty about the pressures of their lives, the facade they maintained. The conversation had ended in a mutual, unspoken recognition of emptiness, which led with the swift, unforgiving momentum of an avalanche to the room upstairs. It was a single, non-romantic, profoundly lonely act of seeking oblivion. Ethan closed his eyes, recalling the details now. The geometric pattern of the carpet, the way the street noise muffled, the cold, stark realization in the morning that he had not just betrayed Clara, but he had betrayed the man he thought he was. Over the next few days, Daniel's psychological warfare escalated subtly. At a midweek gathering for Clara's team, Daniel found Ethan leaning against the bar. "Beautiful tie, Ethan," Daniel commented, a smooth, low murmur that was meant for no one else. "Silk twill, isn't it? Very subtle sheen." Ethan felt his muscles tense. "Thank you. I believe it is." Daniel's smile was chilling. "I'm a fan of texture, you know. Sometimes the softest touch leaves the hardest mark." He paused, then lifted his glass, his eyes holding Ethan's. "Cheers to the complexity of human connection." As Daniel walked away, his hand brushed Ethan's wrist, a fleeting, accidental contact that felt like an electric shock. The message was clear. "I know the texture of your life, and I can unravel it." Clara, completely oblivious, was a whirlwind of professional enthusiasm. She and Daniel were inseparable at the office, strategizing late into the evenings. When she arrived home, her mind was buzzing with marketing jargon and corporate triumphs. "Daniel is brilliant, Ethan," she said one evening, tossing her briefcase onto the marble counter. "Absolutely ruthless, but brilliant. We're finally going to break through on this pitch. He sees the angles I missed." Ethan watched her, his own anxiety mirroring the distance in their marriage. He seems intense. That's what it takes to win, Clara retorted, her tone slightly defensive. You of all people should understand that, Ethan. You seem wound up lately. Are you sleeping? You're preoccupied. It's the new stadium design, isn't it? Don't let the pressure get to you. I need you to be present for the dinner on Friday. The accusation of being preoccupied was a bitter irony. She saw the symptom, not the disease. She attributed his emotional withdrawal to his work, incapable of imagining the true source of his tension was standing right next to her at the office. Ethan realized that Clara's ambition, her single-minded focus on building her career, served Daniel's purpose perfectly. Her blindness was Daniel's shield. Driven by a desperate need to understand his executioner, Ethan began digging into Daniel Sterling's digital footprint. It was a tedious, clandestine operation carried out late at night when Clara was asleep. He found the usual: Harvard MBA, successful stints at major firms, a curated Instagram profile showing sleek travel and minimalist design. But Ethan was looking for the cracks. He found them on an old, almost forgotten industry blog, in the comments section of a finance article from 6 years ago. A user named DS had engaged in a bitter, protracted argument with another user about a corporate merger that had allegedly destroyed a small, successful startup. In the fury of the debate, DS had posted one cryptic, emotional rant. They think success is worth every sacrifice. They think nothing matters but the climb. I lost everything that night because of that mentality. They'll pay. Every one of them. Ethan cross-referenced the dates and the context. The merger DS was raging about was one that had been spearheaded by the very company Clara and Daniel now work for. And the timeline? It overlapped perfectly with Daniel's supposed move to New York, and, more chillingly, with the night of their encounter. A knot of ice formed in Ethan's gut. Daniel's motive was not just personal revenge against Ethan. It was a complex blend of corporate and personal retribution. The night they spent together, that raw, vulnerable conversation, had been misinterpreted or perhaps weaponized by Daniel. Ethan was not just a cheating husband. He was a representative of the successful corporate machine Daniel hated. The casual one-night stand had been reframed in Daniel's mind as a profound offense, a symbol of the moral hollowness of the powerful men he despised. Ethan understood then. Daniel wasn't going to expose him to ruin his life out of spite. Daniel was going to expose him to make a point, to dismantle a symbol. And the company dinner, the pinnacle of their carefully constructed corporate identities, was the perfect stage for the demolition. Ethan gripped his desk, the glossy surface cold beneath his fingers. He had 48 hours until the dinner. He was not just fighting for his marriage anymore. He was fighting for control over his own narrative, against a man who saw him as the perfect collateral damage. The invitation arrived late Tuesday evening, a casual text from Clara. Daniel wants us to join him for a quick dinner at the Dearborn. Working through the weekend plans. Be ready by 7. The seemingly innocuous request was, to Ethan, an official summons to the psychological arena. Daniel wasn't content with whispered threats. He wanted to watch Ethan sweat up close. The Dearborn was all dark wood, polished brass, and quiet, high society hum, the perfect setting for a meticulous dismantling. As they settled into a banquet, the contrast between the two men was stark. Ethan was impeccably controlled, every movement calculated to project ease. Daniel was simply easy, his confidence radiating outward, a predatory warmth. The conversation started professionally, about the pitch in the company dinner. Then Daniel smoothly steered the discussion toward territory only Ethan understood. I find, Daniel mused, swirling the wine in his glass, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's over the rim, that the most successful men, like Ethan, are the ones who can maintain absolute composure under pressure. They compartmentalize so effectively. A difficult night, a sudden failure, it's tucked away, never to see the light of day. Out of sight, out of mind. Clara nodded admiringly. That's Ethan. He's incredibly stable. Never cracks. Ethan felt a muscle twitch near his jaw. Stability is the architect's first principle, he replied, forcing his voice to be steady. You build on sand, you lose everything. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping an intimate octave. But sometimes, Ethan, the sand is all there is. And sometimes you have to admit that you are the sand, that the foundation was flawed from the beginning. It's liberating, actually. The confession. He paused to slice into his steak, and the air crackled with unspoken meaning. Ethan knew Daniel wasn't talking about a faulty blueprint. He was talking about guilt, lust, and betrayal. Later, over dessert, Daniel touched upon a tiny detail from that New York hotel room: the view. "Chicago is fine," Daniel said, gazing out the window at the distant lights, "but it's a controlled view. I prefer the raw, frantic energy of New York, especially the view from the upper floors. Something about seeing all those lit windows, knowing all the secrets being kept behind the glass." He didn't need to say more. Ethan remembered standing in that New York room, looking down at the frantic, indifferent city, feeling like the only soul capable of profound error. Daniel was doing more than reminding him. He was demonstrating complete control over Ethan's memory. The stress of maintaining the facade during the dinner was immense. When they returned to the penthouse, the polite professionalism evaporated, replaced by brittle fatigue. "Why did you order the sea bass?" Clara snapped as she threw her coat onto the sofa. "You know you hate sea bass. It's always rubbery at Dearborn. You ruin the flow of the meal when you order something you don't even like." "It's just sea bass, Clara," Ethan retorted, the small argument a necessary vent for the massive, unspoken truth pressing down on him. "Why are you so agitated? Was Daniel giving you trouble at work?" "No, Daniel is fine. He's focused. He's exactly what I need right now. You're the one who's off kilter, Ethan. You were stiff and quiet all night. Did you even smile once? You look like you're constantly bracing for a punch." "I am bracing for a punch, Clara," he thought bitterly. A punch aimed at the very heart of the lie we live. The root of their friction was no longer sea bass or work pressure. It was the corrosive presence of the secret. Their life was too perfect, too fragile to withstand the weight of his guilt. The desire to confess, to simply scream the truth and be done with the masquerade, became overwhelming. The next morning, Ethan waited until Clara was brushing her teeth, her back to him, focused on her meticulous oral hygiene routine. Now his inner voice screamed, tell her everything. End the tyranny." He walked up behind her, watching her reflection in the mirror. A beautiful, driven woman he genuinely loved, yet one he had systematically deceived. He opened his mouth. The words, "Clara, I have to tell you something about New York," forming in his throat. She rinsed, turned, and met his eyes with a clinical sharpness. "Look, Ethan, if you're still worried about the Riviera pitch meeting, stop. You need to focus on Friday. This dinner is where the firm locks in the perception of the winners. I need us to look seamless. I need you to be my husband. Can you handle that?" The unspoken plea, "Don't ruin this for me," hung heavily in the air. Ethan saw not his wife, but the image she had worked so hard to create and protect. Confessing would not just break his heart, it would shatter her professional platform, her identity, and the stability she desperately craved. He couldn't do it. Not yet. He retreated, swallowing the words, letting the moment pass into the realm of things left eternally unsaid. He managed a thin, exhausted smile. "Of course, Clara. Seamless." Later that afternoon, a non-work text message arrived from an unknown number. Ethan knew instantly it was Daniel. The message was short, brutal, and served as the final countdown to the dinner. "See you at the dinner. Bring your A game, Ethan." It wasn't a question or a request. It was an order, a formal challenge. Daniel wasn't looking for an apology or a confession. He was looking for a reaction. Ethan deleted the text immediately, a cold resolve hardening his fear. If Daniel wanted a game, Ethan would play. He would wear the face of the devoted, unflappable husband, and he would not give Daniel the satisfaction of watching him break. The stage was set for the ultimate public humiliation, and Ethan intended to stand tall when the spotlight hit. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was a cathedral of corporate vanity. Chandeliers dripped light onto 1,000 sequined dresses and polished shoes. This was the annual dinner, the highest ritual of Clara's firm, and the air was thick with the scent of ambition, expensive perfume, and champagne. Everyone was a performance. Everyone wore a mask of success. Ethan had chosen his armor carefully, a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that mirrored the depth of his dread. He moved through the crowd, a perfect, quiet escort, his smile fixed, his gaze steady. He was playing the role of the devoted, successful husband, and he was determined not to falter. This was his A-game, as Daniel had commanded. Clara, radiant in crimson, was in her element, a magnet for influence. She introduced Ethan to partners and executives, his presence a silent testament to her stability and stature. For the first hour, Ethan felt the fragile illusion holding. He was the pillar of strength, the architect of stability. But the atmosphere tightened the moment Daniel Sterling entered the scene. Daniel moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knows he has cornered his prey. He didn't approach Ethan directly. That would be too simple. Instead, he positioned himself in Clara's orbit, becoming her shadow. He was the quintessential admired colleague. He laughed at Clara's jokes with just the right level of respect, his hand occasionally settling on her arm or the small of her back. Touches that were ostensibly platonic and professional, yet intimate enough to register. Ethan watched from across the room, forced to maintain his glass-in-hand posture, trapped in the polite circle of conversation with a mid-level executive discussing zoning regulations. Ethan's guts twisted with a mixture of raw jealousy and nauseating self-loathing. He had no moral standing to object to Daniel's proximity to his wife. He had ceded that right 5 years ago in New York. The physical agony of witnessing their shared ease, their sharp, synchronized professional wit, was almost unbearable. He saw the genuine admiration in Clara's eyes for Daniel's intellect, and he wondered if she looked at him that way anymore, or if she only saw the polished exterior he presented. The torture wasn't that Daniel was stealing his wife. The torture was that Daniel was effortlessly inserting himself into the emotional void Ethan had created. As the dinner progressed and the wine flowed, Daniel engineered a moment of isolation. Clara was distracted by the CEO, laughing brightly, her back to the main room. Daniel extricated himself from the nearby group and moved toward Ethan, crossing the distance with unnerving slowness. The noise of the ballroom suddenly faded for Ethan, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The air between them felt charged, electric with the weight of their shared secret. Daniel stopped an arm's length away, his eyes glinting under the chandelier light. He held a glass of dark whiskey, the color of old guilt. "Ethan," Daniel said, his voice carrying the exact cadence of professional camaraderie, yet imbued with a steel that only Ethan could hear. Ethan met his gaze. "Daniel, enjoying the festivities?" Daniel took a slow sip of the whiskey, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. He let the silence stretch, forcing Ethan to hold attention. Then the corner of his mouth curved into that devastatingly familiar smirk, the one Ethan had first seen 5 years ago, and then again weeks ago. It was a look of cold, superior knowledge. He leaned in, the cedar and spice of his expensive cologne momentarily overwhelming the room's perfume. His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, a velvet dagger aimed straight at the heart of Ethan's composure. "How does it feel, Ethan, to stand here, watching her, knowing you could lose the whole gilded structure in a single, ugly second, knowing it's me who holds the match? How does it feel?" The question wasn't about the act of betrayal, it was about the consequence, the impotence of fear, the agony of helplessness. It was the ultimate psychological victory. A wave of dizziness washed over Ethan. He could feel the eyes of the polite society around them, though he knew they saw nothing but two professional men having a cordial exchange. This was the moment, the apex of Daniel's game. Ethan had two choices: shatter or stand firm. He felt the despair, the rage, and the profound, lonely defeat. But then, a sudden, cold resolve took hold. If he couldn't fight Daniel's knowledge, he would fight his reaction. He would not give Daniel the satisfaction of witnessing his fear. He would not flinch. Ethan's mouth felt dry, but he managed to lift his whiskey glass slightly in a mock salute. He held Daniel's gaze, a terrifying, agonizing stretch of time, where the whole 5 years of lies balanced on a thread. And then, Ethan Miller, the man who had perfected the art of performance, summoned his last reserves of strength. His face remained expressionless, but the corners of his lips lifted, slowly, deliberately, into a pale, empty imitation of joy. It was not a genuine smile, but a desperate, brittle shield. And I just smiled back. He held the smile, a frozen mask of indifference, refusing to acknowledge the power Daniel held. "It feels exactly as it should, Daniel," Ethan replied, his voice just as low, just as steady. "Perfectly under control. Always." The answer was a lie, but it was a defiance. Daniel's smirk faltered for the slightest fraction of a second, a flicker of disappointment that Ethan had not cracked. The moment passed, Daniel straightened, giving a short, curt nod of professional respect, and walked away back to the crowd. But the damage was done. Ethan had faced the abyss and knew that the smile he wore was not a sign of victory, but of profound, terrifying surrender to a new, ongoing reality. The truth was out there, and he was now living its consequence. The whole room was just a backdrop for his private, burning hell. The drive back to the penthouse was conducted in a silence heavier than any argument. The polished facade of the Miller power couple had been stripped away, leaving only two exhausted individuals in the climate-controlled confines of their luxury sedan. When they finally entered the apartment, the quiet perfection of the space felt hostile. Clara tossed her crimson shawl onto a Mies van der Rohe chair, her movements sharp with frustration. "You were insufferable tonight, Ethan," she said, her voice low but laced with steel. "I needed you to be engaging. I needed you to be present. And you spent the entire evening looking like a wax figure waiting for the heat." Ethan didn't bother to deny it. The mask was too heavy to put back on. He loosened his bow tie, the silk suddenly choking him. "And what about you, Clara? You and Daniel were practically auditioning for a two-person play. All those shared glances, the inside jokes about market penetration, it was exhausting." Clara's eyes flashed. "That's called professional synergy, Ethan. Something you clearly don't understand anymore. You're becoming stagnant. You're distant. And don't you dare turn this back on me because I'm successful." "It's not the success," Ethan finally exploded, the controlled anger of 5 years boiling over. "It's the distance. We talk about market share and zoning laws, but when was the last time we talked about us? You're pouring all your passion into the firm, and you come home to this beautiful, empty shell and expect me to simply fill the background like a piece of abstract art." The argument was fierce, brutal, and desperately necessary, yet it never touched upon the actual subject, Daniel or the New York betrayal. It was an argument about the gaping, emotional emptiness that had made the betrayal possible in the first place. They fought about the quiet death of their intimacy, the prioritizing of image over connection, the failure of their love. They were two architects tearing down a structure not with wrecking balls, but with bitter words about its inherent, fragile design. Finally, Clara retreated to the bedroom, slamming the glass door with a force that rattled the high-rise silence. Ethan stood in the living room, the city lights reflecting the chaos in his mind. He pulled out his phone, intending to delete Daniel's last text again when a new email popped up. It was from Daniel's personal address, with the subject line, "Just a thought." Ethan opened it, expecting a final gloating taunt. What he read instead stopped him cold. "Ethan, I saw your face tonight. You wore the mask well, but I saw the panic behind the eyes. You probably think this is about simple revenge. You think I'm trying to steal your wife because you stole one night from me. You don't understand. That night wasn't just a one-off mistake for me, Ethan. I was in New York to reconcile with the only man I ever truly loved, who had given me an ultimatum to leave my corporate life. I was supposed to meet him the next morning, but I was so lost, so drunk, and so furious at the world, at men like you, that I ruined it. When I woke up, I chose to walk away from him entirely, ashamed of my weakness. The point is, your casual mistake cost me my future. And for 5 years, I've watched men like you, successful, untouchable, with the perfect wife, and I wanted you to feel the same desperate, agonizing helplessness I felt when I realized what I had lost. I didn't want your wife, Ethan. I wanted you to face the ruin you caused both to me and to the sanctity of your own life. The secret is the cage. You're welcome. Ethan sat down hard on the sofa, the polished leather suddenly cold beneath him. The email was not a threat. It was a devastating confession of pain and a complex, displaced rage. Daniel wasn't a cold-blooded schemer. He was a deeply wounded man whose revenge was born from his own loss. He didn't want Ethan to be ruined. He wanted Ethan to be exposed, to feel the weight of his own moral failure. The realization was profound. He and Daniel were connected not by lust, but by shared, agonizing guilt and a mutual destruction of a significant relationship. As Ethan scrolled back to reread the email, trying to process the painful empathy he felt, he heard a small noise from the bedroom. He quickly minimized the screen. Clara emerged quieter now, wearing her silk robe. She walked past him to the walk-in closet, but something was different. Her eyes, usually so sharp, were clouded with a new kind of suspicion. "I was looking for my passport," she murmured, her hand rifling through an old travel bag that Ethan used for his domestic trips. "I think I left it in this bag after your New York trip a few years ago." She pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a scrap of hotel dry cleaning receipt, yellowed with time. It was from the Midtown hotel he had stayed at 5 years ago. He had meant to shred it. "This is from the Intercontinental," Clara noted, her voice carefully neutral. "I remember you told me you stayed at the Marriott near the client's office. You said the Intercontinental was too expensive, Ethan." She didn't accuse. She simply stated the discrepancy, the small, undeniable administrative lie that pointed toward a larger, more corrosive deception. She held the receipt like a piece of evidence. The lie about the hotel, the one he had created to cover the one-night stand, was now the key to unlocking the entire, painful truth. Clara looked up, her expression a mixture of profound shock and calculated inquiry. "Why did you lie about where you stayed, Ethan?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, cold and unforgiving. The game of avoidance was over. The physical evidence had finally bridged the distance between the unspoken conflict in their marriage and the 5-year-old betrayal. The dry cleaning receipt felt like a death warrant in Clara's hand. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on Ethan, demanding an explanation. The silence was deafening, a vacuum sucking the air from the lavish apartment. "Why, Ethan?" Clara's voice was a low, dangerous whisper, void of the usual marketing polish. "The Marriott was 5 minutes from your meeting. Why the Intercontinental miles away? Who were you with? Was it someone from the client's team? Was she younger? Was she what you thought I wasn't anymore?" Her line of questioning, brutal and direct, revealed her assumption. The transgression was a standard, heteronormative affair with a female colleague or stranger. The pain in her eyes was immense, but it was a pain Ethan understood. The conventional hurt of a betrayed wife. Ethan looked at the woman he had loved, respected, and meticulously lied to for 5 years. He saw the structure of her life, her success, her reputation, her entire identity as the power couple, trembling on the brink. He could take the easy way out. Let her assume it was a woman, allow the lie to continue in a different form. It would be cleaner, easier for the world to digest, and perhaps easier for her to move past. But the hollow victory of the previous night, the forced smile he had given Daniel, had drained him of all capacity for performance. Daniel's email had given him an agonizing clarity. The secret was the cage, and to be truly free of Daniel's manipulation, to finally claim ownership of his own guilt and consequences, he had to tell the whole, messy, incomprehensible truth. Ethan walked slowly toward her, his feet heavy on the marble floor. "Clara, sit down. It wasn't a woman." She blinked, confused, but remained standing. "What are you talking about? Who was it then? A client?" "I don't care about their gender, Ethan. I care about the lie." "It was a one-night stand, just one night, 5 years ago in New York. I was lonely, I was exhausted, and I made a catastrophic mistake." He swallowed hard, the shame a bitter taste in his mouth. "I broke our vows. I cheated on you." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, gripping the receipt until her knuckles turned white. "I knew it," she breathed, the words heavy with resignation and fury. "I always knew something was wrong. Who was he, Ethan? Give me a name." This was the hardest part, the final brutal twist. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, steeling himself for the inevitable explosion. "The person I was with that night," Ethan said, opening his eyes and meeting her gaze, his voice low and steady, "was Daniel Sterling." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The raw pain on Clara's face morphed into a mask of pure, blank incomprehension, followed by a terrifying realization. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She laughed, a high, unnatural, hysterical sound that echoed off the glass walls. "Daniel?" she repeated, the name a foreign object on her tongue. "Our Daniel? My colleague? The one I'm working on the biggest project of my career with? You mean you and Daniel?" Her voice trailed off, the complexity of the betrayal paralyzing her. The shock was multi-layered. The betrayal itself, the fact that it was homosexual, a truth Ethan had never fully confronted in his own defined life, and the unbearable irony that the man who now held the key to her professional success was the same man who had been the instrument of her marriage's destruction. The elegant, simple narrative of a cheating husband was replaced by a convoluted, sickening plot twist that threatened to derail not just her marriage, but her entire professional identity. "Yes, Daniel," Ethan confirmed softly, the truth a sudden, dizzying lightness. "He knows everything about that night. He's been playing a game with me. The question he asked me tonight, how does it feel? It was about this. He wanted me to break." Clara finally dropped the receipt. She took a step back, shaking her head, tears finally streaming down her cheeks, not of anger, but of profound bewilderment. "This isn't just betrayal, Ethan. This is a farce. This is gross. You've been living a lie so deep, so twisted, that I don't even recognize the reality we've built." She pointed toward the door, her hand trembling. "Get out. I can't breathe the same air as that secret anymore. I can't look at you. I can't look at my office. I can't look at anything." Ethan did not argue. He had sought this conclusion, this cleansing fire. He spent the next hour moving through the apartment, the golden cage with the quiet, measured dignity of a man executing his own sentence. He packed a single suitcase with clothes and toiletries, leaving behind the tailored suits and the architecture blueprints, the remnants of the life he had pretended to live. As he stood at the front door, he looked back at Clara. She was still standing in the exact spot, her body language a portrait of shattered elegance, staring at the floor. "I love you, Clara," he said, the truth finally pure and unburdened. "And I'm profoundly sorry for the damage I've caused to us and to Daniel." Clara didn't look up. "Go, Ethan," she whispered. "Go and find out who you are when you're not standing next to me." Ethan opened the heavy door and stepped out into the impersonal hallway. He knew that walking away from the penthouse was not the end of his suffering, but the true beginning of his consequence. He had exchanged the suffocating luxury of the golden cage for the stark, lonely reality of the unknown. His marriage was officially over, not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a closing door high above the indifferent city of Chicago. 6 months had passed with the quiet, relentless passage of time that defines profound loss. Ethan Miller no longer looked like the polished architect of the Chicago elite. He was living in a stripped-down, exposed brick loft in the West Loop, his life minimized to the essentials. The removal from the opulent penthouse had been a painful, necessary surgery. He worked long, grueling hours, not for the glory of the optics, but for the sheer focus it demanded. He was building again, but this time, he was trying to build himself a new moral structure on a foundation of honesty. The self-interrogation had been brutal. He had finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions, accepting that his moment of weakness was a direct consequence of his long-term emotional avoidance. The work, designing affordable housing units, a stark contrast to the sterile towers he once specialized in, became his penance, his tangible attempt at redemption. He stopped looking for forgiveness from others and started looking for acceptance of his own flawed nature. Meanwhile, Clara's life was a public minefield. The news of their separation, while contained by their carefully worded statements, had shattered the narrative of the perfect Miller couple. She faced pity, gossip, and the quiet judgment of their social circle. The corporate world, always hungry for drama, was watching her closely. Her deepest torture, however, was Daniel. He was still her co-lead, and he executed his role with flawless professionalism. He had transformed into the sympathetic colleague, offering measured, non-invasive support, his eyes now conveying a profound, almost paternal understanding. It was a role Ethan knew Daniel relished, the manipulator turning into the empathetic observer. Clara had to attend meetings with Daniel, strategize with him, and accept his praise without flinching. Every word he spoke, every shared success, was a razor-sharp reminder of the grotesque irony of her situation. She felt a burning, sick fury, but her career demanded her silence. She could not afford to break down, not in front of him and not in front of the firm. She realized that Daniel's final act of revenge was not the exposure, but the forced proximity to the man who represented both her husband's betrayal and her own humiliation. One rainy afternoon, sitting alone in her massive penthouse, staring at the empty space Ethan had left, Clara finally allowed herself to analyze the wreckage without anger. Ethan's confession had been a violent opening, forcing her to confront the fact that their marriage was a beautiful facade built around two people who had ceased to truly see or desire each other years ago. They had mistaken shared ambition for love and commitment to their image for commitment to their vows. The betrayal was unforgivable, but the reason for it, the profound loneliness Ethan confessed, was terrifyingly recognizable. She had been lonely too, drowning her own needs in work, using success as a substitute for intimacy. The painful realization was this: Ethan's infidelity, as twisted as it was, had salvaged her from a lifetime of living a lie. It had given her the permission to feel, to rage, and finally to step off the relentless treadmill of being the perfect wife. Ethan initiated the meeting through a brief, respectful email, suggesting they meet to finalize the separation documents. They chose a neutral, impersonal coffee shop downtown, away from their usual haunts. When Ethan walked in, he was thinner, his face showing the lines of stress and sleepless nights, but his eyes were clear, absent of the guarded fear that had defined him for years. "Hello, Clara," he said, his voice quiet. "Hello, Ethan." There was no drama, no accusations. They sat in silence for a moment, just two people profoundly tired of fighting. They discussed the documents, the division of assets, the sale of the apartment, with a detached politeness. Then Clara looked up from the papers, truly looking at him for the first time in 6 months. He's still at the firm," she said, the name tasting like ash. Ethan nodded, understanding the silent pain behind the statement. "I know. I read his email that night. He wasn't just trying to hurt me, Clara. He was trying to hurt the image of the man he thought I was. The guilt, it destroyed something important in his life too." Clara absorbed that, a tiny softening in her features. "You're trying to understand him?" "I'm trying to understand all of it," Ethan replied simply. "The complexity, the reason, my part in it. I don't expect you to forgive the action, Clara, but I hope you can someday forgive the failure of who I was. I failed us both by not telling the truth about my own unhappiness sooner." Clara didn't offer absolution. "I haven't forgiven you, Ethan, but I understand why it happened. We both abandoned the marriage long before New York. Your actions just made it official." It was not a loving conversation, but it was perhaps the most honest they had ever shared. It was the tired, compassionate recognition of two souls who had hurt each other deeply, yet who were now committed to their separate, truer paths. They hadn't found reconciliation, but they had found truces, with each other and with the painful truth. They had paid the price of the breakdown, and now they were quietly building the foundation for their separate futures. 3 months after their meeting, Clara Miller sent a simple, terse email to the CEO of her firm. Her resignation was effective immediately. The decision sent shockwaves through the organization. For 6 years, she had defined herself by her climb up the corporate ladder, her identity inextricably linked to the power and ambition of her role. But the continuous proximity to Daniel Sterling, the insidious irony of their professional partnership, had become toxic. She realized that by staying, she was clinging to the ruins of the image she and Ethan had manufactured. Clara launched her own boutique consulting firm, specializing in ethical marketing, a venture far smaller, less glamorous, but entirely hers. She chose meaningful work over glittering status, prioritizing peace over prestige. She was no longer half of the power couple. She was just Clara, finally building something authentic. Ethan, having navigated the difficult process of divorce and the public dismantling of his perfect life, felt a profound emptiness followed by a restorative quiet. He knew he owed one last, crucial piece of communication. He sat down and wrote a letter, not an email, addressed to Daniel Sterling at his office. Daniel, the game is over, not because you lost, but because I chose to leave the board. For 5 years, I let the secret define me, and for 6 months, I let your knowledge control me. Your question that night, how does it feel, was the catalyst. It forced me to choose truth over performance, even if the price was everything I thought I wanted. I'm writing to tell you that I finally confessed the truth to Clara. All of it. The result was not the instantaneous ruin you perhaps intended, but a slow, painful process of liberation. I lost the marriage, the penthouse, and the image, but I gained myself back. I am finally accountable for my actions. The cage is open. I understand your pain. Your email made that clear. We were both victims of a larger emotional failure that night, and we both used each other to cover the shame of our respective lives. I regret the destruction my weakness caused in your life. I hope you can find your own path out of the shadow of revenge. I am no longer the man you betrayed or the man you sought to punish. I am simply Ethan Miller. I am free. He mailed the letter and never received a reply. Daniel's silence was not a sign of defeat, but of quiet acceptance. The game had reached its natural conclusion. The objective, the exposure of the truth, had been achieved. There was nothing left to say. The final meeting between Ethan and Clara was 6 months later at the Chicago courthouse to finalize their divorce decree. It was anticlimactic. The legal proceedings were sterile, the papers signed with dry pens. Later, they stood on the steps of the courthouse, watching the city traffic flow around them. They were legally separated, financially independent, and spiritually exhausted. I'm doing good work, Ethan, Clara said, pulling her simple wool coat tighter. My new firm, it feels right. No more chasing headlines. I'm glad, Clara. I've started designing a community center in Evanston. It's small but real. There was an understanding between them now that was deeper than their romantic love ever was. They had moved beyond accusation and defense, reaching a place of mutual, wounded compassion. I was never truly angry at the idea of who you slept with, Ethan, Clara confessed softly. I was angry that you had to go looking for connection outside of us, and I'm angry that I let us get to that point. Ethan nodded. It was a failure shared, if not in action, then in spirit. We were masters of perfection, Clara, but bankrupt in intimacy. I think we can be friends someday, real friends without the gilded layers. Clara gave him a small, genuine smile, the first true smile he'd seen from her in over a year. Maybe, Ethan, maybe, but only on the condition of absolute honesty. They parted ways not with a hug or a longing glance, but with a respectful nod and a quiet wish for good luck. They did not reconcile, nor did they try to resuscitate the corpse of their marriage. They had paid the price of redemption, the loss of their perfect life, but in return they gained the truth and the courage to live without the lie. Ethan returned to his loft. The sun was setting, casting long, stark shadows across the exposed brick. He stood by his window, looking not at the imposing, beautiful city skyline he had once helped design, but at the reflection of his own face in the glass. It was a face marked by loss, divorce, and regret, yet it was also undeniably his. He remembered Daniel's question. How does it feel? It felt terrifying. It felt quiet. But beneath the loss, there was a profound sense of peace. He was alone, But he was no longer trapped. He was no longer lying. Ethan took a deep, clear breath, and this time, completely alone, with no audience, no spouse to deceive, and no antagonist to defy. He let a small, genuine smile bloom on his face. It was the smile of a man who had survived the fire, accepting that love and life was not about being perfect, but about having the courage to live openly and truthfully in the beautiful, messy aftermath.